We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides. We're very fortunate to have with us today actor, filmmaker, author, journalist, political commentator, a Renaissance man for the ages, Mr. Yuval David. Thanks for joining us, Yuval.
Well, you know, to be a Renaissance man recognized by a Renaissance man is delightful. If only I had the curls on top of my head as you do, I would definitely be much more successful. But I do have curls in my mind. My mind is twisted by the insanity that we're seeing across society. So I wish that the curls were only in my hair and not in my thought process.
Well, one can be fixed and the other can't, unfortunately. So let's talk about those particular detriments that we're witnessing recently. Now, you and I got brought together initially over the shooting that happened in Washington, D.C. this month, a tragic situation that for some reason appears to have, at the time of recording, largely disappeared from the headlines. Now, you were in Washington, D.C. when that happened. Could you give us your take on the feelings that came out then and the initial aftermath?
Well, the feelings that came out were horrendous and still are horrendous feelings that can be defined as shocked but not surprised. We've been listening to the language of these horrible groups chanting out in their riots, in their protests, in their demonstrations, violent, hateful speech that calls for intifada, that calls for jihad, that masks the calls for violence with rhyming couplets and placard strategy that might sound like a nursery rhyme, but what's beneath it are calls for violence. So how surprised can we really be when horrendous terrorist attacks happen here in the United States? We're seeing these terrorist attacks happening across the world by people who are telling us what they're going to do, and then they do it. The problem is security. The problem is safety for all of us. And the other problem is we're not condemning these hate groups for what they are.
That's a very important point you raise, I think, about they're telling us what they're going to do. And we see this and in my country, in Britain, we've seen the marches nominally supporting Gaza. Many people openly supporting Hamas, and they're chanting the free Palestine, same as the killer did in Washington, D.C. And it seems to me that the legacy media, they seem to have this idea that when they're chanting intifada or from the river to the sea, they're giving them the most generous interpretation of what they mean by those phrases. And it's an interpretation that wouldn't be afforded to any other group. And that strikes me as strange, that you have these people who say they're marching for something, but the something is very clearly a direct call for violence against the Jewish community. And so why do you think it gets downplayed so much? Because these terror attacks, as you say, and it was a terror attack. So what you find is that you've got this whole large movement, and then it's pushing the idea of intifada and violence, and they seem surprised when it happens.
Well, this is one of the things that the Islamicization of the West has done so strategically and so brilliantly in terms of taking violent movements, focusing on the rhetoric, and using the rhetoric to manipulate people who might not otherwise be violent until they can possibly become violent themselves. The Islamist movements understood that they cannot only present the violence of the Islamist intifada, jihad, terror agendas of bullying tactics to murder anybody who's not just like them, which includes Jews, Christians, Israelis, Druze, Baha'i, Buddhists, Hindus, secular Muslims, All of those people are infidels according to them and deserve to die. So within their own countries and within the regions that they dominate and control, they're able to openly engage in violence and slaughter people. Now, when they focus on the West, they're not able to present the violence as a way to manipulate all of these peoples. So they use the language, they use the placard strategy, they use these nursery rhymes that if they rhyme, they must be true. And for the useful idiots across the UK, across the United States, across Canada, across all of these countries in Europe that we're seeing, there are people on the far left who are being manipulated by these nursery rhymes because they're presented in the most simplistic ways. And
Yeah.
that's what they're doing.
It's very much it's that from the Saul Alinsky Rule for Radicals playbook in terms of creating a simple message, repeating it often, and trying to create that earworm situation. So it's in fact, and this is a slight aside, it reminds me of I think it was Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, where he said all you need to do is give them a slogan that they can chant and they don't have to think for themselves. And this sloganeering here, it comes with a whole host of baggage behind it, and yet they can be presented at a very, very surface level. And this is really a thin veneer of it's about justice, it's about fairness for people who are oppressed, and it's all. It seems to me it's all part of a larger. And I don't want to target all socialists with this, but of a larger socialist push towards destruction of cultural values, things that have essentially made the Western world the success that it is. And they want to drag that back. And as you rightly point out, Islamists are climbing on the back of the socialist movements. And in some ways, I think the socialist movement's climbing on the back of Islamism to
Oh, absolutely,
try
because
and
they
use each
see,
other for a seed of destruction.
well, it's the some people call it the red green
Okay.
alliance to describe the alliance between far left activists and Islamist movements.
Mm.
It's one of the strangest and most dangerous coalitions in modern history, where we see leftists who believe in gender equality, LGBT rights, secularism, free speech, civil liberties, and Islamists who believe in Sharia law, gender segregation, religious supremacy, and death to apostates and gays. The only thing that they seem to agree upon is this virulent hatred of Israel and, by extension, Jews, this virulent hatred of anybody who is deemed successful, right? So we've seen all of these old, ancient anti Semitic tropes
Yeah.
rise up where they're condemning Jews because they think Jews are successful. Well, throughout history, for 1,000 years more, Jews were condemned because they were different. Jews were condemned because they weren't Christian. Jews were condemned because they weren't Muslim. Jews were condemned and criticized for being capitalist. Jews were condemned and criticized for being socialist and for being communist. Jews were condemned for being separate than society. And then Jews were criticized for being part of society. Jews keep being blamed again and again and again anytime there are social ills that are rising up and bubbling up to the surface. So within this red-green alliance, they're focusing on Jews in this overly simplistic oppressor versus oppressed narrative. And we're hearing more and more people speaking about it as we recognize the hypocrisy and the idiocy that is prevailing throughout the progressive movement, capital P progressive, because I'm a lowercase p progressive. I do believe in progress, but the progressive movement has gone awry.
Let's continue talking about that after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.